The straps dug into my shoulders as I stood at the edge of the trail, looking down at what used to be a safe path. Behind me, the shelter was being evacuated. In front of me, 20 minutes of loose rock and steep descent. And pressed against my spine, inside my hiking backpack, was a dog who hadn't moved in 3 days. His name was Buddy, tag number 822. And according to every assessment in his file, he was untransportable. If you've ever had to make a choice between following the rules and doing what's right, you'll understand what happened next. Hit that like button and subscribe because this story doesn't go where you think. And drop a comment if you've ever met a dog that the world gave up on too soon. The hillside facility had been overcrowded for months. Buddy's kennel sat in the back corner, the section where dogs go when they've run out of options. He wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud. He was just absent. Curled so tight his spine curved like a question mark, head tucked, eyes open but seeing nothing. The staff called him a shutdown case. The kind of dog that doesn't bark for food, doesn't react to voices, doesn't fight the leash. The kind shelters quietly move to the bottom of the list because resources go to dogs people actually want to meet. His medical chart read, extreme fear response, non interactive, possible neurological trauma, requires specialized behavioral intervention and medical support including anti-anxiety medication, calming supplements, orthopedic bedding for suspected joint pain. Not suitable for standard adoption protocol. What it should have said was, this dog has been invisible for so long he forgot how to be seen. We didn't know much about Buddy's history. Surrendered by someone who never gave a name. No collar. No chip. Just matted fur. A body that flinched at air. And paws that wouldn't hold his own weight. The intake photo showed a dog staring past the camera, like he'd already decided the world wasn't worth looking at. He'd been with us for 17 days. In that time, 6 families walked past his kennel without stopping. 3 volunteers tried to leash train him, and gave up after he collapsed in the hallway, trembling so hard his tags rattled against the concrete. One vet tech whispered to me that Buddy reminded her of dogs she'd seen in hoarding cases, the ones who live in crates so long they forget how to stand. When the evacuation order came through, the director pulled me aside. She'd seen me watching Buddy, knew I'd been slipping him torn pieces of my lunch through the kennel bars, the only food he'd take. She handed me the transport list. Buddy wasn't on it. We can't move a dog that won't walk homes. And we can't sedate him for a journey like this without a full medical workup we don't have time for. I'm sorry. She wasn't wrong. Policy existed for a reason. But policies don't account for the look in a dog's eyes when he knows he's being left behind. I went to the supply closet and pulled out my old hiking pack. The one I used to carry injured trail dogs before my back gave me warnings I couldn't ignore anymore. It still smelled like mountain air and regret. When I knelt beside Buddy's kennel, he didn't move. I unzipped the pack, lined it with a soft fleece blanket I'd brought from home, and opened his kennel door. His eyes tracked my hands, waiting for pain. Instead, I lifted him slow and steady and lowered him into the pack. His body was so light it hurt. He fit perfectly, curled like he'd been designed for that exact space. I expected panic, thrashing, the fear response his chart promised. But Buddy pressed his head against the padded interior, and for the first time since I'd met him, I felt his body relax. I adjusted the straps. The weight settled against my spine. His heartbeat tapped against my back, fragile but steady. And then I heard it, the smallest, softest exhale. Like relief. He'd spent 17 days afraid to be touched. But inside that pack, surrounded by warmth and my scent and the rhythm of my breathing, Buddy stopped fighting. The backpack wasn't just a rescue tool. It was the first safe place he'd ever known. I looked at the trail one more time. The rain had started. Rocks were slick. My knees weren't what they used to be. And if I slipped, we'd both go down. But Buddy's breathing had steadied. His tiny paws gripped the fabric near my shoulder blade. Not in panic. In trust. So I tightened the straps, took a breath, and started walking. What I didn't know yet was that Buddy wasn't just weak. He was sick. And the real fight wasn't getting him down that trail. It was convincing him that life on the other side was worth surviving for. The first 3 steps down that trail, I counted my breathing. In for 4, out for 6. The kind of rhythm that keeps panic at bay when your body's reminding you of every year you've lived. Buddy's weight shifted slightly against my back, and I froze, waiting to see if he'd try to escape. But he just adjusted, pressing deeper into the pack's padding. Like he was burrowing into safety itself. I thought about the morning I'd first noticed him, 2.5 weeks before this moment. Before the evacuation warnings. Before the impossible choice. It was a Tuesday. The shelter had been over capacity for 47 days straight. Every kennel filled, some doubled up. The intake line stretched out the door by 9 a.m., and the phone hadn't stopped ringing since we opened. Surrender after surrender. Lost dogs whose owners never called back. Strays from the streets, the woods, the highway median. The building hummed with a specific kind of chaos that only people who've worked in overwhelmed shelters understand. It's not just noise. It's needed, layered so thick you can taste it. I'd been volunteering there for 6 years. Long enough to recognize the signs of a system buckling under its own weight. Staff moved through their routines with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd learned to protect their hearts by not looking too close. Can't save them all. That's what we told ourselves. That's what we had to believe to show up the next day. Buddy's kennel was in the back row. The quiet section. Not where the puppies bounced against chain link begging for attention. Or where the vocal dogs sang their desperation to anyone passing by. This was where dogs went when the shelter had tried everything and nothing worked. He was small for his breed mix, maybe 30 pounds, with brown and white markings that would have been beautiful if he'd been healthy enough to hold his head up. But Buddy didn't look at people. Didn't respond to his name. Didn't eat unless you left the food and walked away for 20 minutes. He just curled in the back corner of his kennel, nose tucked under his tail. Breathing so shallow you had to watch his ribs to know he was alive. Not sick enough to treat. Not strong enough to move. That's what I'd overheard the assistant director say, during a staffing meeting. They weren't being cruel. They were being realistic. With limited resources and a wait list of dogs who actually responded to human interaction. Buddy had become invisible by default. But I'd started noticing things. Small things. Microsignals that suggested someone was still home inside that shut-down body. The way his eyes would track footsteps without moving his head. How he'd watch the shadows on the kennel wall when staff walked past, calculating distance and trajectory. I saw him grip the edge of his thin blanket with his front paws when the shelter got loud, holding on like it was the only solid thing in his world. One afternoon, I sat on the floor outside his kennel for 15 minutes, not talking, just breathing. And Buddy's breathing synced with mine. Slow. Steady. Like he was listening to something beyond words. That's when I knew. He wasn't gone. He was hiding. Then the weather report started. Instable terrain. Erosion warnings. The hillside facility sat too close to a ridge that had been flagged by county inspectors for months. When the evacuation order finally came, it came fast. 72 hours to relocate over 100 animals to partner shelters across 2 counties. The transport coordinator stood in the break room with a clipboard, checking off names. Dogs who could walk on a leash. Cats who could handle carriers. Animals with medical clearance for a 2-hour drive. Buddy's name wasn't called. I waited until the coordinator left, then walked to the back row one more time. His kennel card had been updated with a single line in red pen, non-transportable. Alternate arrangements pending. Alternate arrangements. That was the phrase they used when there were no arrangements at all. I knelt down and looked through the chain link. Buddy's eyes were open, staring at nothing. But when I shifted my weight, his gaze flickered. Just for a second. Toward me. And I realized something that made my chest tighten. Buddy knew he was being left behind. He'd known it his whole life. That's when I made the decision that would change both of us. The first step down the trail sent a jolt through my knees that I felt in my teeth. The second reminded me why I'd stopped doing rescue hikes 3 years ago. The third made me wonder if I'd miscalculated everything. But Buddy's weight against my back was steady, trusting. And that was enough to keep moving. The path had degraded faster than anyone predicted. What used to be compact dirt was now a maze of exposed roots and loose stones that shifted under my boots. Rain fell in sheets, turning everything slick. Each step required a calculation. Where to plant my foot, how to distribute weight, whether the ground would hold. I kept one hand on the trail rope someone had strung years ago. The other stayed near my hip, ready to catch myself if I went down. Because if I fell, Buddy fell. And a dog this fragile wouldn't survive the impact. Behind us, the shelter had gone quiet. Everyone else had evacuated hours ago using the access road on the north side. But that route required dogs to be crated, loaded into vans, stacked like cargo. Buddy would have died from the panic alone. The vet had made that clear when she'd examined him 2 days prior, recommending calming chews and a heated dog bed for his anxiety. Things we didn't have time to source before the evacuation. So here we were. The back way. The hard way. The way that might cost me another herniated disc but wouldn't cost him his life. I felt his breathing through the pack. In, out, in, out. Sink to my own rhythm like he was learning how to exist from my lungs. His small body had stopped trembling. The rigid tension that defined every interaction I'd had with him had melted into something softer. He wasn't just tolerating this. He was resting. It hit me then, halfway down the trail with mud on my boots and rain soaking through my jacket. Buddy had never felt safe enough to rest. Not in 17 days at the shelter. Maybe not in his entire life. A root caught my boot and I stumbled forward, catching myself hard against a tree. My shoulder screamed. The pack shifted. And for one terrible second, I thought I'd hurt him. But Buddy didn't yelp. Didn't thrash. His paw pressed harder against my back. Gripping. Holding on. I've got you, I said, more to myself than to him. We're okay. My voice must have meant something because I felt him settle again. His head nudged the pack's interior near my shoulder blade. A tiny movement that felt like communication. Like he was saying, I know. I trust you. The trail switched back twice more before opening onto the access road below. My legs burned. My back would punish me for this tomorrow. But when I reached level ground and stopped to catch my breath, I realized something had changed. The rain had stopped. The emergency vehicles were gone. And Buddy was still calm. I carefully lowered myself to sit on a flat rock, moving slowly so I wouldn't jostle him. The pack stayed on my back. I wasn't ready to take it off yet. Wasn't sure he was ready either. We made it, I whispered. From inside the pack, I felt the smallest shift. His nose pushed against the mesh panel near my neck. Warm breath on my skin. He was checking to make sure I was still there. And that's when I understood. Buddy hadn't just survived the evacuation. He'd survived it with me. The backpack wasn't carrying a rescue case anymore. It was carrying a dog who'd just learned what it felt like to be chosen. Now came the hard part. Getting him healthy enough to believe he deserved it. The first 10 steps were the hardest. Not because of the terrain, though the path had already started to crumble beneath my boots. Not because of the weight, though my lower back was already sending up flares of complaint. The hardest part was feeling Buddy's body tense with every shift of my movement. His small frame rigid against my spine, waiting for the world to hurt him again. I kept my breathing steady, Slow inhales. Measured exhales. The kind of rhythm that says we're okay, we're safe, nothing bad is happening here. After the third minute, I felt it, the slightest release of tension in his shoulders. His head settled deeper into the padded fabric. He was listening to my heartbeat. The rain picked up as I navigated the first switchback. Water turned the trail into a slick of mud and loose stone. My boots slid twice in the span of 30 seconds. Each time, I caught myself with my hiking pole, but my pulse spiked hard enough that I knew Buddy could feel it through the pack. His paw flexed against my shoulder blade. A tiny, deliberate grip. Not pulling. Not scrambling. Just holding on. I'm still here, that little movement said. I'm still trying. God, that almost broke me. My knees weren't built for this anymore. 53 years of hiking, kneeling beside kennels, carrying bags of kibble up shelter stairs. It all comes due eventually. Every step down sent a sharp reminder through my joints, the kind of pain that makes you reconsider your choices. But then I'd feel Buddy's breathing sync with mine, steady and intentional, and I'd take another step. We were two broken bodies trying to make it down a mountain. The difference was I'd chosen this. He hadn't chosen any of it. Halfway down, the wind kicked up. It carried the smell of smoke from somewhere distant. A reminder that the evacuation wasn't precautionary, it was necessary. I pulled my jacket collar up and hunched forward to shield Buddy from the worst of it. That's when I felt him shift. Not in panic. In adjustment. He pressed his body tighter against my back, tucking himself deeper into the pack, like he understood we were in this together. His nose nudged the fabric near my neck. Once. Twice. Then he went still again, his breath warm against my shoulder. It was the first intentional touch he'd ever initiated. I had to stop walking for a second, just to steady myself. Not because of my legs. We're almost there, Buddy, I whispered, my voice rough. Just a little further. His ear twitched. He'd heard me. The final stretch of trail opened into a clearing where the evacuation vehicles were parked. Volunteers were loading crates, checking manifests, calling out names. I could see the relief coordinator waving people toward the transport vans. We'd made it. I set my hiking pole down and carefully shrugged the pack off my shoulders, lowering it gently to the ground. The plan was simple. Unzip the pack, lift Buddy out, get him checked by the mobile vet team, and move him into a soft-sided travel crate lined with blankets for the drive to the temporary shelter. But when I unzipped the pack and reached in to lift him, Buddy did something I didn't expect. He pulled back. Not in fear. Not in aggression. He just pressed himself deeper into the pack, his paws bracing against the sides, his eyes wide and locked on mine. Asking a question I understood completely. Do I have to leave? The backpack had become more than a rescue tool. It was the first place where the world hadn't hurt him. Where touch didn't mean pain. Where closeness meant safety instead of threat. I knelt there in the mud, rain dripping off my hood, staring at a dog who'd spent 17 days refusing to connect with anyone. And he was choosing me. Choosing this moment. Choosing to stay. Okay, I whispered, rezipping the pack halfway. Okay, you can stay a little longer. I lifted the entire pack, Buddy still inside, and carried him toward the medical tent. His breathing had steadied. His body had softened. And for the first time since I'd met him, I saw his eyes close. Not in exhaustion. In rest. If this moment just hit you in the chest, you're not alone. Thousands of people in our community have told us these stories help them see rescue differently. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Because Buddy's journey is just beginning, and you need to see what he does when he finally learns to trust again. The vet tech's face told me everything before her words did. She'd unzipped the pack just enough to slip a stethoscope inside, working around Buddy's body while he stayed curled in his safe space. I watched her expression shift from clinical assessment to something harder. The look medical professionals get when they find suffering that's been ignored for too long. "How long did you say he's been at the shelter?" she asked, her hands gentle as she checked his gums. 17 days with us. Before that, we don't know." She nodded slowly, pulling back. "His gums are tacky. Severely dehydrated. I'm guessing he hasn't been drinking properly for weeks, maybe longer." She made a note on her tablet. "I need to do a full exam, but I can already feel heat in his hip joints. And his heart rate," she paused. "His heart is racing like he's been running for miles. But he's completely still." "Panic disorder? Chronic stress response. His body's been in fight or flight mode so long it doesn't know how to shut off." She looked at me over her tablet. "This isn't just fear, Holmes. This is medical neglect that's become a neurological pattern." They set up a quiet corner of the medical tent, away from the chaos of the main evacuation. I laid out the pack on an examination mat, and this time, Buddy let me lift him out, but only because I kept one hand on his back the entire time. The moment I tried to step away, his breathing spiked and his legs started to shake. So I sat on the floor beside the exam table while the vet worked. The full picture emerged piece by piece. Dehydration severe enough to need subcutaneous fluids. Joint inflammation in both hips and his right shoulder, consistent with prolonged immobility, or being confined in a space too small to stand. Muscle atrophy. A resting heart rate is almost double what it should be. And when they checked his teeth, they found evidence of stress fractures, self-soothing grinding, probably during sleep, if he'd been sleeping at all. "We'll start him on anti-anxiety medication," the vet said, preparing a syringe. "Fast-acting for now, then we'll transition to a daily regimen. I'm also prescribing joint supplements, glucosamine and chondroitin, and pain management for the inflammation." She handed me a printed care sheet. "He's going to need orthopedic bedding. His joints can't handle hard surfaces anymore. Elevated food and water bowls, so he's not straining his neck and shoulders. And this." She held up a soft recovery harness. "If he can't walk steadily, this will support his weight without putting pressure on the inflamed areas." I looked at Buddy. He was sitting on the exam table, pressed against my hip, his eyes tracking every person who moved through the tent, waiting for the next bad thing. "The sleep trauma is going to be the hardest part," the vet continued. "Dogs like Buddy often develop hypervigilance. They can't achieve REM sleep because their nervous system won't let them feel safe enough to fully rest, even when they're exhausted. What do we do about that?" She met my eyes. Consistency, routine, a safe environment, and time. A lot of time. That night, I set up a corner of my temporary quarters with everything the vet had prescribed. I unrolled a memory foam orthopedic dog bed, the kind designed for senior dogs with arthritis. Placed elevated bowls filled with water and softened kibble. Set out the bottles of medication with detailed dosing schedules. Then I sat on the floor next to the bed and waited. Buddy stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, exhaustion pulling at every inch of him. He looked at the bed. Look at me. Took one tentative step forward, then stopped. I patted the orthopedic cushion. It's okay. It's yours. He took another step. Then another. When he reached the bed, he sniffed it carefully, testing for threats that weren't there. His legs were shaking. He needed to lie down. His body was screaming for rest. But he didn't. Instead, Buddy bypassed the bed entirely, walked directly to where I was sitting, and collapsed against my leg. His full weight pressed into my thigh. His head rested on my knee, and within seconds, his eyes closed. Not on the soft, supportive bed designed for his damaged joints. On me, because the orthopedic cushion was just a thing. And Buddy had spent his whole life learning that things don't keep you safe. Only people do. And only if they stay. The first night in my house, Buddy didn't sleep. He stood in the corner of the living room. Head low, eyes tracking every shadow that moved across the walls. I'd set up his orthopedic bed near the couch, memory foam, washable cover, the kind the vet recommended for dogs with joint inflammation. He looked at it like it might swallow him whole. So I didn't push. I sat on the floor nearby, reading a book I wasn't absorbing, just being present. Around 2 a.m., his legs finally gave out. He lowered himself to the hardwood floor, still in that corner, still watching. But his eyes closed. He slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke up on the couch the next morning, stiff and disoriented, Buddy was still there. Sprawled. Not curled. His legs stretched out, his breathing deep and even. I'd never seen him take up space before. I didn't move. Didn't want to break whatever spell had finally convinced his body it was allowed to rest. When he woke, he didn't startle. His eyes opened slowly, focused on me and stayed there. No flinch. No retreat. Just recognition. I stood up carefully and walked to the kitchen. Filled his elevated food bowl with the prescription kibble the vet had sent home. Easy on sensitive stomachs, fortified with joint support supplements. I set it down and stepped back. Buddy approached slowly. Sniffed. Then I ate. Not the frantic gulping of a dog who thinks the food might disappear. Not the refusal of a dog too scared to want anything. He ate like someone who believed there would be breakfast tomorrow too. He drank water without flinching when the bowl shifted. A small thing. A massive thing. Over the next few days, I started noticing the changes. When I moved from room to room, Buddy's eyes followed. Not in fear, in tracking. Making sure he knew where I was. If I left to get the mail, I'd come back to find him sitting near the door, ears forward waiting. Not to escape. To see me come back. One morning, I was sitting on the couch with my coffee, and Buddy walked over. Not to the spot behind me where he'd been positioning himself. Not to the corner where he could see all exits. He sat down next to me, close enough that his shoulder brushed my leg. He didn't look at me, just stared ahead, like he was testing whether this was allowed, whether closeness could exist without consequence. I stayed still, didn't reach for him, didn't make it a moment, but my hand rested on the couch cushion, and after a minute, Buddy shifted, just slightly, just enough that his head leaned against my knee. He wasn't hiding from the world anymore. He was letting himself be part of it. And for the first time since I'd zipped him into that backpack, I let myself believe we were going to be okay. 3 weeks after the rescue, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. It was 2:47 a.m. The kind of hour when your brain can't distinguish between dream and reality fast enough. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, trying to orient myself. Another crash. This one from the back porch. Probably a raccoon. Maybe a possum knocked over the recycling bin. Nothing to panic about. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Humans. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, fingers fumbling for the flashlight app. That's when I noticed Buddy wasn't in his orthopedic bed at the foot of mine. He was standing at my bedroom door. Not cowering. Not hiding. Standing. His body was locked in a rigid stance I'd never seen from him before. Every muscle tensed. His head lowered slightly, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the hallway. And he was shaking. God, he was shaking so hard I could see it even in the dim light from the street lamp outside. But he wasn't backing down. Buddy, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Come here, baby. Come back to bed. He didn't move. Another sound from the porch. The scrape of something metal. My adrenaline spiked. This wasn't an animal. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbed the aluminum bat I kept in the closet, a relic from a decade of living alone, and moved toward the hallway. Buddy glanced back at me once, just to confirm I was behind him, then turned his attention back to the door. He took 3 steps forward. positioned himself directly between me and whatever was out there. This was the dog who couldn't stand to be touched 3 weeks ago. The dog who collapsed in hallways. The dog whose medical chart said he'd given up. And now he was choosing to stand in front of me, trembling with terror, but refusing to run. "I've got this, buddy," I said softly, moving past him toward the back door. "You don't have to." He followed, stayed at my hip. His breathing was rapid and shallow, but his feet kept moving. I flipped on the porch light. A young man, maybe 19, froze like a deer in headlights. He'd been trying to pry open the storage shed where I kept tools and camping gear. His eyes went wide when he saw me, and then landed on Buddy. Buddy didn't bark, didn't lunge, but something in his posture changed. He leaned forward, just an inch, and the growl that came from his chest was so low and steady it vibrated through the floorboards. The kid ran. I stood there for a long moment, bat still raised, adrenaline still buzzing through my veins. Then I looked down at Buddy. He was still shaking, still terrified, but he hadn't left my side. I knelt slowly, setting the bat down, and he collapsed against me. His whole body trembled as I wrapped my arms around him, feeling his rapid heartbeat against my chest. "You didn't have to do that," I whispered into his fur. "You didn't have to protect me." But he had. The dog I'd carried down a mountain in a backpack. The dog I'd fed with a spoon because he was too scared to eat from a bowl. The dog who needed calming medication just to sleep through the night. He'd chosen courage when it mattered. I'd spent weeks saving him. But that night, Buddy saved me right back. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the rescue. I was sitting on the floor of my living room, sorting through Buddy's medication schedule, anti-anxiety pills with breakfast, joint supplements with dinner, calming chews before bed. His orthopedic dog bed sat in the corner, the expensive one the vet had insisted on, the kind with memory foam that molds to arthritic joints. Buddy had been sleeping on it every night, but only after I'd sat beside it for 20 minutes, my hand resting on his side until his breathing slowed. He was curled there now, watching me with those amber eyes that had started to hold something other than fear. Something like curiosity, maybe even trust. I stood up to refill his water bowl. And that's when I heard it. The soft scrape of claws on hardwood. I turned around slowly, afraid that any sudden movement would break whatever was happening. Buddy was standing, not leaning against the bed frame for support, not braced against the wall, just standing on his own forelegs, trembling so hard I could see it from across the room. His front left paw shook. His back legs wobbled. Every muscle in his small body was working overtime just to hold him upright. But he was standing. Buddy. I breathed his name like a prayer. His eyes locked on mine. And then, with the kind of determination that makes your chest ache, he lifted his right front paw. One step. His leg nearly buckled. Pain flashed across his face. The kind of pain that comes from joints that haven't moved properly in months, from muscles that have forgotten how to carry weight. But he planted that paw down and shifted his weight forward. 2 steps. I dropped to my knees without thinking. Arms open but not reaching. Not grabbing. Just waiting. Letting him choose. 3 steps. 4. His breathing came in short, labored bursts. Sweat darkened the fur along his spine. He stopped halfway across the room, his whole body shaking. And for a second I thought he'd give up. Thought he'd collapse back into the safety of surrender. But Buddy looked at me, really looked at me, and took another step. 5. 6. 7. Every movement was a battle. Every step was a refusal to be helpless. A refusal to let fear win. A refusal to stay small and invisible and broken. When he finally reached me, his legs gave out. But I was there. I caught him as he fell forward, his small body collapsing into my arms, his heart hammering against my chest. He buried his face in the crook of my elbow, exhausted and shaking and utterly spent. But he'd walked. On his own. Toward me. Because he wanted to. I held him there on the floor, both of us trembling for different reasons, and realized something that made my throat tighten. Buddy wasn't just learning to walk again. He was learning to come home. 6 weeks had passed since the evacuation. Buddy's recovery had been slow, measured in millimeters rather than miles. The orthopedic bed I'd ordered arrived on day 3, memory foam designed for dogs with joint pain. He'd circled it suspiciously for an hour before finally lying down. The anti-anxiety medication took 2 weeks to show real effect, combined with the calming supplements the vet prescribed. His appetite returned gradually, aided by elevated food bowls that didn't force his aching body to crouch. But the real changes weren't visible on any medical chart. They showed up in the way he'd started following me from room to room, and how he'd learned to sleep without startling awake every 20 minutes. In the soft play toy he'd finally carried in his mouth yesterday, gently like he wasn't quite sure he was allowed to enjoy it. Today, I decided to give him a choice. I opened the back door to the yard. Full width. No barrier. The afternoon sun stretched across the grass, warm and inviting. Buddy sat in the doorway, watching the open space with curious eyes. I unclipped his leash. Let it fall to the floor. You can go, I said quietly. No one's stopping you. He looked at the yard, then at me, then at the yard again. His body didn't tense, didn't prepare to bolt. He simply stood there, considering. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain. Birds called from the trees beyond the fence. Everything about that open door said freedom. Buddy took 3 steps forward, then stopped. He turned his head back toward me, ears slightly forward, asking permission, asking if this was real. Go on, I encouraged, gesturing toward the grass. Go explore. He walked into the yard, slow and careful, his paws tentative on the soft ground. He sniffed the air, investigated a fallen leaf, looked back at me again to make sure I was still there. I stayed in the doorway, watching, waiting. Buddy made it 15 feet before he stopped. He stood in the middle of the yard, bathed in sunlight, with all the space in the world to run, to leave, to choose something else. Instead, he turned around and walked back. Not because he was scared, not because he didn't understand freedom, but because he'd found something better. He walked past the open door, past the threshold, and sat down directly beside my feet, his shoulder pressed against my leg. Then he looked up at me, and I swear I saw it. The exact moment survival became something else. He'd spent his whole life waiting to be abandoned, running because staying had never been safe. But he wasn't running anymore. Buddy leaned his full weight against me, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes. He'd finally found what every rescue dog searches for. Not freedom from something, but someone worth staying for. 3 months later, I found myself standing in the doorway of my bedroom, watching something I never thought I'd see. Buddy was asleep on his orthopedic memory foam bed. The one we'd ordered after the vet confirmed his joint inflammation wasn't just from neglect, but from months of sleeping curled so tight his muscles had begun to atrophy. The bed sat in the corner where morning light came through at an angle, warm but not too bright. He was stretched out, fully stretched out, front legs extended, back legs loose, his entire body taking up space like he'd finally decided he was allowed to exist in it. No trembling. No scanning the room every few seconds. No positioning himself against the wall where he could see both the door and the window. Just rest. I'd spent so many nights watching him sleep in those first weeks, counting his breaths to make sure they stayed steady, adjusting his calming supplement dosage with the vet, keeping his anti-anxiety medication on schedule, learning which sounds made him flinch, and which ones he'd started to ignore. The crinkle of a treat bag used to send him into a panic. Now he'd lift his head, interested but not afraid. The elevated food bowls helped. He didn't have to crouch so low that every meal felt like submission. The soft recovery harness we used on walks meant he could move at his own pace without pressure on his chest. The familiar bedding we'd scented with lavender calming spray gave him something consistent to return to. But none of those things alone would have saved him. I walked quietly into the room and sat on the floor a few feet from his bed. Buddy's ear twitched. His eyes opened halfway, groggy and soft. When he saw me, he didn't startle, didn't go rigid. He just blinked slowly, the way dogs do when they feel safe. And then he did something that still gets me every time. He stretched his front paw forward, just a few inches, until it rested near my hand. Not asking for anything, just connecting. I placed my palm over his paw, gentle and still. His eyes closed again, and within seconds, his breathing deepened back into sleep. People ask me sometimes how I knew he'd make it. How I knew he was worth all the medication, the special bedding, the sleepless nights, the vet bills, the patience it took to teach him that the world wasn't only pain. The truth is, I didn't. Buddy didn't survive because he was strong. He survived because I carried him when he couldn't walk. Because I didn't need him to be brave or resilient or grateful. I just needed him to hold on long enough to realize that someone was willing to stay. And in the end, that's what saved us both. He taught me that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about letting someone hold you together until you remember how to stand. I sat there on the floor until the light shifted and afternoon turned to evening. Buddy slept through all of it, stretched out and still, finally living the life he was carried toward. Peaceful. Safe. Home. Buddy's story didn't end when I carried him down that mountain. It ended here, in this quiet moment, 3 months later. But there are hundreds of dogs still waiting in shelters right now. Dogs just like Buddy who need someone to see them. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you real rescues, real transformations, and real hope. Because every dog deserves to find their person. And maybe, just maybe, one of these stories will inspire you to become that person for a dog who's still waiting. Thanks for watching. And thank you for caring.